This is Adopt Responsibility. I'm Caleb Landis, here with today's guest, Karl Landis. Karl holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in theology from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. He has taught undergraduate and graduate level classes as an adjunct lecturer in theology, sociology, survey methods, and statistics. He has been the Senior Study Director at the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina and the Director of Leadership Development and Curriculum Development for Lancaster Mennonite Conference in Pennsylvania. He currently serves as the lead pastor of Mount Joy Mennonite Church in Pennsylvania. He's been happily married for 37 years and has 3 adult children, which is more important to me than any of those other things because I'm one of those 3 adult children. That's right, he is my dad. Dad, it's an honor to have you on. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's nice to be here.
All right. So the plan for today is to talk about the church and government, figuring out how these things relate to each other. And especially in light of some of the recent political tensions, this feels like a very timely moment to be having this discussion. So to start, Dad, let's get an idea of your personal experience with the church and government and how these things relate to each other. So I wanted to ask, what are some of the defining moments in your own journey of understanding this relationship that really stand out in your mind?
Well, thanks for asking. It's I've been in other settings where people, like we get to know each other by going around and telling our defining moment stories. And I realize when I go into those settings that I'm now over 50, and so I have to be kind of selective in how I answer the question because life experience adds up, and I could give you a lot. But I would say that actually, as you and I have talked about this a little bit offline beforehand, I think one of the things that I think about where I am now and then kind of how I've gotten here. And I think probably one of the earliest and most foundational shaping influences in this part of my thinking. I don't know that I realized this before we started having this conversation, but I would say actually growing up outside of the United States was a really defining, a critical shaping experience for me, not just a moment, but an experience. My parents were missionaries in Central America with the Mennonite Mission Agency. And we left the U.S. when I was 5, and we came back when I was only 10. But those 5-6 years just totally, they shaped a lot of things about my thinking, and this is one of them that as I look back on it, I think just the experience of having lived outside the United States and to realize how the countries organize themselves differently, that political systems work differently in different places. I think it's helped me to not be just totally locked into the way that I know things happen in the United States. And then I think also, related to that, realizing that the countries that we were in, especially in Guatemala, was a country that was dominated in some ways by the United States, and the United States has invaded there and deposed leaders and things like that. So I think it's given me I'll just say it's definitely shaped my perspective and given me maybe a different way of thinking about what it means to be a Christian in this country than I would think I would have if I had just lived here all my life. So that, I think that was definitely a crucial shaping factor. And then the fact that I grew up as the son of a Mennonite pastor, Mennonite missionary, introduced me to a theological framework that is a kind of a minority perspective and voice in the Christian world. But I think I've been really grateful for that. But from an early age, understanding in the Anabaptist Mennonite framework this clear distinction between the kingdom of the world and the kingdom of God, I think that's something that I picked up pretty early on. And then more recently in my adult life, I would say the rise of the moral majority movement in the United States in the early 1980s that really called evangelical Christians to engage in the political arena. I think, and hearing the leaders back then saying, oh, this is the most important, each presidential election cycle, they would always say, oh, this is the most important election in our lifetime. And it's crucial that you support this candidate, the candidate that we advocate. Christians just must support this candidate. Well, and then realizing that those candidates were just, they did some things that I approved of, but then they did some things that I thought were just heinous, just awful
Hmm.
things. And so just I think kind of realized what a mixed bag political achievements tend to be,
Yeah.
and how much somebody that you're counting on to do one thing might sort of do that thing, but then they'll do all kinds of other things as well. So
Yeah.
just kind of, I think it made me a little bit more cynical about politics.
Hmm.
So those are a few of the things.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So you got me curious with the moral majority. I'm not too familiar with that. I think, I mean, it's definitely happened in a time where I can't remember. Was that before I was born? I forget what
Yeah,
if you
I
just
think it
said
would
a
have been
time
in the
frame.
decade or so before you were born.
Okay.
I think of it. I don't have the dates right at the top of mind, but I think it was roughly. I think they really emerged very strongly in the late 1970s and helped Ronald Reagan become elected president. And I think he was elected for the first time in 1980, and maybe
Okay.
again in '84. And so they were really in the ascendancy in the 1980s.
Hmm.
And the term moral majority was coined by somebody in that movement to basically saying that we are highly moral people, and we represent the majority population of the United States who are also highly moral people, and we all
Hmm.
agree on. And then they had this list of tenets that they thought were important, that they wanted people
Hmm.
to that they were saying. Well, they were trying to persuade people to vote for these candidates who would support these positions, but it was a lot of what have come to be called family values kinds of things, and respect for the family, respect for the church, and things like that. But the phrase I think was kind of cleverly coined because they're basically saying we are the majority of people in the United States are highly moral people, and we represent them. Was kind of the
Hmm.
idea, and so that was really I think the genesis of what we now call the religious right. Tended
Okay.
to be fairly conservative, and as time went on, I think became more and more closely identified with the Republican Party and with some of its more conservative uh, elements in the Republican Party. Did
Yeah.
I answer your
Did you?
question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
All right.
did you feel convinced by that at the time? Was it something you bought into, or were you even pretty skeptical of seeing that unfold?
Well, I think I wasn't a really active person politically when that started. I mean, I was just in my early 20s myself at that point.
Hmm.
And I think I mean, their style was brash enough that I think it was. I found that a little off-putting and kind of raised some caution flags for me. I think theologically, I was mostly sympathetic with a lot of the things that they stood for, but I think that one of the things that they advocated for then, and as far as I know, still do, would be like a really strong U.S. military, and
Oh,
that
okay.
gave me a lot of pause because I thought, well,
Hmm.
how is that a direct outgrowth of Christian teaching,
Yeah.
that the United States as a specific nation state should have a really strong military. So,
Hmm.
I mean, there were some things that were inconsistent. I think one of the main issues that they focused on, and there's a whole history of this too, but one of the issues that they focused on was abortion, and we're really calling people to make that a focus of their voting behavior, their political
Hmm.
choices, and so on. It turns out that was somewhat cynically identified by some consultants to the Republican Party as a way to pull in religious conservatives, but that's
Hmm.
another conversation, I guess.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, that's something that I feel like I am becoming more and more aware of as I see things unfold. It just seems like there's always an angle in there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yep.
it just ideally feels like we should have politicians who are, you know, have this strong conviction of what's right and wrong, and they head to Washington to, you know, do what
Right.
they feel in their heart is
Right.
right. But
Right.
so
Right.
often it feels like that's not the case. It feels like people have
Yeah.
these. extra motivations outside of that
Well,
that end up
I
being
think almost
disappointing.
everybody. I'm sorry, I didn't let you finish.
No, go ahead.
I think almost everybody starts out with some level of altruism, like they want to do good, they want to do well, and they want to serve people's interests. But then at a certain point, you realize, hey, I want to get reelected. I want to continue to do what I'm doing, and so I think that
Mm-hmm.
begins the process of you need to, well, I guess even running for office, you need to build support and coalitions, and so you want to ally with
Mm-hmm.
anybody who will support you, and that can pull you further and further away from your core.
Yeah.
So.
Hmm.
But I
So
think
you
in
said,
terms of the issue of abortion, I think apparently the Republican consultants were kind of fishing for an issue that would unite evangelicals and
mm-hmm.
theological conservatives. And
Yeah.
at a certain point, they realized that abortion would serve really well, and it has.
Mm-hmm.
It has.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even as you're saying that, I'm like, I just said on a podcast episode the other day to Matt, I was like, hey, I see abortion as one of the most important issues that we are facing right now and can be radically changed by political decisions. So interesting, yeah, to hear where some of those roots may have come from. But so I wanted to ask, you said that in your early to mid 20s you were not very engaged politically. How has that developed over your life? So over the last 20 plus years, would you still say you're somewhat disengaged? Do you feel very engaged or somewhere in between? And what's the evolution of that looked like for you?
well, I would say I'm probably, I mean, if you have a scale from like 1 to 10, I'm probably below halfway in terms of political engagement. I mean, I pay attention to what's being said and what's happening, but I don't, I don't go to political rallies. I'm not registered with a political party.
Hmm.
I vote, but I'm more likely to vote for the presidential election than anything else. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be considered a really active person politically.
I was gonna say I never noticed you leaving the house when I was a kid with a
Yeah.
sign or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's some of the reasons for that we may get into, but I think that I would say that I think you were asking me how have my views developed or changed.
Yeah.
I think I somewhere along the line in my youth, as I was a child, I picked up some of the basics of the teaching that I mentioned about the difference between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think I've always kind of had that as a shaping, framing kind of thought about political involvement. And then I think when I saw the emergence of the religious right in my 20s, I think it was just something I watched happen and developed a reaction to. I mean, a lot of what I just described to you was some of my reaction to what happened. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't, in my view, the behavior of some of those folks hasn't changed a lot, it hasn't improved a lot. I think it seemed to me that they were relying on political action to do things that it really couldn't. And
Mm.
I think one of the convictions that I've come to at some point over those years is that political progress, I'll call it that, political progress, can never bring about the kingdom of God. That God's what God is about is changing people's hearts, and God is about
Mm.
forming communities of people who love and serve each other in a way that is meant to be a witness to the world. None of that's going to happen by political decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way to impact the behavior of people who aren't followers of Jesus, I think, is by persuasion and by living attractive lives, living out
Mm-hmm.
the values that Jesus calls us to in ways that are winsome and attractive and so on. So I think all of that means that that's part of why I've never really gotten all that excited about political stuff. Obviously, political decisions shape our lives and the
Mm-hmm.
possibilities. But I guess I felt like I've seen Christians be corrupted by political power or by their enthusiasm for political power, and I feel like it can get you off track. So I guess I don't know. I would say my basic views haven't changed all that much.
Mm-hmm.
Um, are you? I'm. I. Your video has frozen for me.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
All right, perfect.
So, okay. I would say my basic views haven't changed all that much. I would just say that I'm probably a little better informed now than I was then. And I probably understand the details and the options a little better than I did, but just because of life experience. I probably, as I said a little earlier, I think I probably am a little more cynical about the role of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's part of why I'm also a little bit chastened about engaging more enthusiastically. Partly,
Mm-hmm.
as I said earlier, because I think political solutions are always only partial solutions. I think there can be progress, but they're never the final word on anything. And they also often almost always have unintended consequences. So, we think we're solving problem A, and oops, look at that, we created problem B. We had no idea that would happen, and it was certainly not what we intended. But now we have a new
Yeah.
problem. Problem
Mm-hmm.
A may be somewhat contained, but now we have problem B. Then we try to fix problem
Yeah.
B with a political solution, and look, oh my goodness, we got problem C now. So that makes, I think I'm probably a little more cynical than maybe is warranted there, but that's kind of how
Mm-hmm.
I think about politics.
Well, so even in what you said, and we don't have to go too far off the rails into the weeds here, but I feel like even in what you said, there's somewhat of an argument for conservatism to be made of that. Because if there's this, as you're saying, government intervention in a specific area, if that more often than not creates other issues, then that almost to me seems like, hey, the general idea there would be keep it simple, don't reach into too many things, or just reach into it a tiny bit and don't go too far because that's probably going to have other unintended consequences. Am I reading that correctly, or is that not
Yeah,
what you were
well,
trying to
I
say?
would say it's actually more of a libertarian impulse, and
Mm.
I think I incline somewhat in that direction because from what I've seen, uh, political conservatives say they don't want the government to do a lot, but then when they get in power, they have all these ideas for what the government can do, and I mean, and they, yeah, I mean,
That's a good
administrations of
point.
both major political parties have increased our deficit to
Hmm.
fund the things they wanted to do, and they both have things they want the government to do, and so.
Hmm.
I would say it's actually more of a libertarian impulse, and I'm really cynical about political conservatives who say they want the government to stay small because I would say I've seen the government grow just as much under people who say that as people who
Hmm.
don't. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's
yeah,
really interesting you say that. I was just watching this documentary the last couple of days called Saving Capitalism. It's just easy to find. It's on
uh huh,
Netflix,
okay.
and it's
Saving capitalism.
yeah,
Okay,
it's
I'll
the
write that
main
down.
guy they follow around is it Robert Rausch. He worked in the Bill Clinton administration, and basically what he saw is what you're saying, and now a lot of his work is to travel around and talk to people about government and especially the financial decisions made by government. And
Hmm.
so from when he first came to Washington to now, he said he's just seen this increase of crony capitalism
Hmm.
that in the
Yep,
end is
yep, yep.
ultimately really supported by both sides
Hmm.
politically.
Yep,
And so
yep.
he's just seen that progression happen. And so he's very skeptical about people who, as you're saying, who want to come in with this conservative agenda, but it ends up actually not being what people think it is. And so, yeah, very interesting
Well,
stuff to
yeah,
me.
you remind me of another reason for me to be cynical about politics. And that is that I really hate it when people say one thing and do another,
Yeah,
and I
that's
feel
hard.
like that's the whole game. I feel like
Mm,
that's the whole game with every politician who's running anything other than for this local school board. Like
mm-hmm.
they have to say these things because in an attempt to get elected, and then once they get elected, then they do something completely different, and they're completely shameless about it. And
Hmm.
it seems to be the name of the game. I think everybody does it, and it just seems to be what you have to do. And I just think, really? I
Yeah.
mean, especially for a
Hmm.
follower of Jesus, I mean, is that really what we're called to do? To make
Yeah.
a career out of saying one thing and doing another, and knowing that's what
Hmm.
you're doing?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's another reason why. Uh,
Yeah. Well, I feel like it points to, yes, it's the fault of individuals who are behaving that way, but I feel like it also could point to something being just broken about our system. I
I
mean,
agree.
how
Yes.
is it that
Yep.
that's the game that we're
Exactly.
playing with politics? It shouldn't be that way.
I agree.
And so I don't know what the solution to that is. It seems like we're kind of in this system, and even with all of its flaws, it's produced arguably the most free, prosperous, uh, in a lot of ways, just nation around in the world today. And so, there's a reason people are fleeing other countries and, going through these crazy processes to get into the United States. And there's a reason that people aren't fleeing from the United States, right? It's a place that people want to be. But even within that, it seems like, you know, it's not necessarily because the system is perfect, or it's definitely not because the system is perfect. And I feel like what we're talking about right now is one of the most clear ways that I'm seeing that, as I'm just becoming more and more aware of the political system, how things go, and how politicians behave. And so I don't know. I mean, do you have solutions for that? Do you feel like there are some tweaks to the system we could make to just create more incentives for politicians to have that vision of altruism and the integrity to stick to the things they say?
I don't really have a suggestion there because I feel like there's my focus has really been on doing what I can to build up the church, and I think that's a consuming focus. And I think because of my cynicism about the political process anyway, um, and I feel like I have limited time and energy to
Yeah.
work on tasks, and I feel like the church can absorb more than my full time focus in terms of addressing issues that challenge us in the church. So no, I
Hmm.
don't really have a solution, and I'm not somebody who I think is sort of publicly railing against the government or anything. I mean, we're just having this.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
know
Sure.
this is a podcast conversation, but it's you and I've just been kind of when people ask me the question, as I guess what I'm going to say is when people ask me about
Hmm.
this, I'll tell them what I think, but it's not a big focus of my life. I
Yeah.
agree with you though. I think it's a system problem, and I really do kind of lament that whatever you think of the political candidates the candidates for president, whether now or in this election or the last election or the one before that,
Hmm.
I sometimes I look at the candidates we're picking between and I think, are these really the most capable people that we have in our 300 plus million population? Are these really
Yeah.
the best two or three people we could produce to to choose between to lead us into the next 4 years, given the kind of problems we're facing, all that?
Yeah.
Has our system really done a great job of winnowing the whole thing down to these two or three people, the best capable,
Hmm.
people that are most capable, sharpest minds, most creative thinkers, greatest leaders, whatever,
Hmm.
I don't think so. And so I've gotten as far as thinking, I don't think that's so much. I don't fault the individuals who end up on the ballot. I think it's a system problem that
Hmm.
somehow we have a system that leaves us in this situation. So I've
Yeah.
gotten that far. I don't have,
Yeah.
really clever insights into how that could change.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no, that's definitely not the case. I feel like I have to believe that for my own just general sense of encouragement about the world. I have to believe that the people who've ended up as the final two or three candidates for president are not the best and the brightest and the most capable. I mean, I think they tend to be the people who can convince a specific population of people that they will uphold the party values, or that they will, solve a few specific problems that relate to enough people who will buy into what they're doing. And I think beyond that, they end up being the people who are the best at fundraising, because it requires millions on millions of dollars to run an effective presidential campaign. And so because of that, it's I think, what was this? Was this an article that you passed on to me or someone else? Just reading about how in a lot of ways, politicians have become partly politicians, but also in large part fundraisers.
Hmm.
And a lot of what they do with their time and energy and effort is to raise funds to be
Yeah.
reelected.
Yeah.
And that just feels like a shame. It shouldn't be that you need to be, part-time, 50-40% of your time is spent on fundraising. You should have the clear space to do the hard
Yeah.
task
Yeah.
of being a
Yeah.
politician, figuring out how to make public policy and lead us forward. So,
Well, yeah. Um, there are far better informed people than I am about what the strategy ought to be going forward. One idea that occurs to me, I think this is in place. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think there are countries where the government just issues X amount of dollars for the next leader campaign, whether it's president or prime minister, whatever it is. And so, this party gets this amount of money, that party gets that amount of money, and it's the same amount of money. It comes from the government. That's it.
hmm,
And you're not allowed to spend more than that. Um,
wow,
that would kind of take
that's
care of the problem you're talking about.
that's
But there are
so
probably
seems
unintended
so simple.
consequences to that. Yeah, but there are probably unintended consequences to that I'm not thinking about.
Yeah,
So
yeah. All right, so this feels like a good time to take a step back because we're talking about some the state of things in today's world. But I also wanted to just get some of your wisdom and knowledge that we've talked about again before this conversation. But just for this has I'm sure has been a discussion ever since the time of Jesus and probably even before. But so as a I mean, not speaking on behalf of the church or anything like that, but just as
yeah,
someone who has, spent their life as a member of churches and in different roles in congregations. How have you seen this, or not personally seen, but how have you understood this discussion developing over the last couple thousand years of church history? I know it's an enormous task, but what
yeah,
are some
it is.
highlights that
Well,
stick out to you?
yeah, it is a big question, and that would actually be it would be maybe a kind of a side a distraction from the main focus of your podcast. But it would be interesting to ask that question to people from a number of different denominational traditions and see how they would answer that, because I think where you're located in the denominational spectrum will say something about
Hmm.
how you view the church's relationship to the state, and when it
Hmm.
was more closer to the ideal and when it was further away from the ideal.
Yeah.
But so I'll give you my perspective. So the first 300 years or so before Constantine became Roman emperor, I don't think Christians thought very much at all about their engagement with politics. I think they were just trying to preach the gospel and survive and build a church. And I think
Hmm.
with the emergence of Constantine, you had suddenly the Roman emperor himself was a Christian, and so instead of
Hmm.
um, Christians being pushed to the margins, now all of a sudden he sort of whooshed them right into the center. And
Hmm.
for the Christians at the time, it was wonderful because they could collect money, they could build buildings, they could, they were in more in the center of society and culture at the time.
Yeah.
But then it also brought us into this problem of the combination of church and state, or church and political power,
Hmm.
which for people from some denominational traditions is just great. From the one that I'm part of, that was viewed. I had one colleague at one point who referred to the emergence of Constantine as the fall. We talk
Wow.
about the fall in the garden. He talks about the emergence of Constantine as the fall because he says he would have thought, in his mind, that was the point at which the church lost its way, basically, by getting its hands dirty with politics.
Wow.
So, I mean, the classic thinkers over the centuries, gave shaping framework to this, theological underpinnings. So you have Augustine with his book City of God, where he's looking. I think it was written. It was after the sack of Rome, where people were trying to figure out, how to make sense of things, like where is
Hmm.
God and all of this. And so he wrote the City of God, talking about how, for Christians, the focus was on the City of God and not so much, what was the counterpart, the city of the world. So anyway, that's a whole treatise that
Hmm.
is helpful for people who want to look at the history of this. You have Catholic thinkers throughout what we now think of as Catholic thinkers throughout the years through the years of the unified church. Aquinas in the 1200s, being very much all about order, but giving some careful thought to what it meant to be the church and what it meant to be to participate in the church. Of course, then after him, and before and around his lifetime, you have the Crusaders, who used military power to try to advance what they saw as the cause of the gospel, which was to convert the heathen by any means necessary. That's we now look back on that as a kind of a black mark on the church.
Yeah,
for
for
the way
sure.
they went about that. But they saw themselves as defenders of the faith. I think one of the things that emerged through those centuries that is still with us today is what people sometimes call exceptionalism, where we think we are exceptional. My nation, my people group is exceptional in God's eyes. And so that gives us the privilege or the prerogative to do things like we're special. Our nation, our country is special in God's eyes. And I think that was what was true for the Crusaders. I think they thought, hey, we're special, we're God's representatives. And so basically whatever we do is what God's doing or what God would do, because it occurs to us to do it. And if it increases our political power, then it means that much more political economic power is under the control of God's people. But I think to some extent, all of the nations of Western Europe have had that notion over time. I mean, if you look at like the history of England, especially when it was powerful and so on, they saw themselves as God's people and doing God's work around the world and bringing civilization, bringing Christian civilization to the rest of the world. And we now look back and say, yeah, but you were flogging people, you were murdering people, you were, destroying their countries and making them basically slaves to you and all that.
Yeah.
So
not the greatest representation of Jesus there.
Well, exactly. So, but I think that mindset was true in England. It was true in Germany, true in France at different points in time. Spain, or before that, was sort of the defender of the Catholic faith. Around the time of the Reformation, they were determined to bring the Protestants in England back into the fold, and so there was sort of actual warfare between Catholics and Protestants, because the Catholics thought the Protestants were going off track.
Yeah.
So then, this is a little bit of a jump ahead, but then you jump ahead to American exceptionalism, where I would think there are Christians today who think the United States as a nation state is God's special people, that we have a special place in God's purposes. And I think, obviously a lot of good things have come out of the United States in terms of mission work, but I think it's definitely a mixed bag. And I think the United States has done a lot of harm around the world too. And I think people don't generally want to have a nuanced view of that. They want to think it's all good or it's all bad. And they think, well, since it's not all bad and we can think of some amazingly good things, then it's all good. And anything you say to the contrary is just, you're just not a patriot. So,
man, why do we do that? Why do we want things to be so black and white when just about nothing is? I just feel like there's this tendency to want to skip over all the nuance and get to, this dogmatic view of things, and I just don't think it works that way hardly ever.
It simplifies your thought life, though. If things are just this way, just that way, and you can keep things in their boxes and you move on. That's right.
Just put this in that box, and then we're just we're good to go.
But so anyway, so we're back to the centuries, church history. In the time of the Reformation, Luther and Calvin, two of the main reformers there, are what we call magisterial reformers, because they were comfortable with continuing this close allegiance or alliance between the church and the state, and using state power to accomplish church objectives, and using state power to punish people who ran afoul of the church. Sometimes for theological reasons. It wasn't like civil reasons, but it was theological reasons. And so you have the Anabaptists in this time. They actually predate Calvin, but the Anabaptists being persecuted by other reformers because they wanted to go further in the reforms. And so they were probably some of the first to advocate for a clearer separation of church and state. And I think it probably wasn't genius on their part initially. I think it was probably just saying, hey, we're Christians, you're Christians. It doesn't seem right that you're using the physical means of the state to persecute and to kill us. And so they took the stance that it was wrong for Christians to use the power of the state to be involved with, physical
Hmm.
warfare.
Hmm.
But again, I think it was probably not some clever insight. I think it was just saying, hey, I mean, we would think the same thing if half of our congregation rose
Yeah.
up against the other half, and one of them started
Yeah.
killing
Seems
the
like
other. We'd say, wait a minute, something's wrong here.
it's a pretty
Um,
reasonable conclusion given
yeah.
that
So
lived
I think that's
experience.
where that notion came from. And so yeah, so that's the tradition that I was born into, and I think it's the one that I've
Hmm.
been familiar with that I mentioned earlier, and seeing it like a
Yeah.
clear separation between what's okay for the people in the kingdom of God to do and what's okay for people in the kingdom of the world to do, and making a pretty sharp distinction there.
Yeah.
Um,
So something that I wanted to ask you, you're talking about these magisterial reformers. You mentioned Martin Luther, and who was the other main
John
one?
Calvin. John
John
Calvin.
Calvin.
Yeah.
So I
1500s.
feel like I don't have a good understanding of how to separate these things. So, it's also has to do somewhat with what we were talking about before with the moral majority. So just as it's going on in my mind right now, I'm thinking, so, legislating morality, probably not a great idea. Like we don't, as a church, we're not trying to legislate the Christian faith, because when that has happened, and there are places now where that's happened, and you have churches that are run by the state, and it gets all mixed together, and it's really strange and weird, and lots of bad things come from that.
Right.
At the same time, though, we also want a government that is going to provide freedom, that is
Yes.
going to uphold the rule of law and
Yes.
justice and protect
Yes.
its citizens and have, you know, and so how do we distinguish those things? Like how far can we go? Because that is its own uh, level, or how do I say it? That's an outworking of moral beliefs, that people deserve freedom, that people deserve to be protected, that deserve justice when something goes wrong. So much of the reason that the laws exist in the Western world that they do today is because of faith, because of things that the Bible says. And so, how do we distinguish between, the right amount of government morality, but and having that, valuing that, and appreciating that, but not trying to push our whole Christian faith into politics?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, unfortunately, it's not very clearly answered by anything in the New Testament. So I think whenever we wrestle with this, we venture into wisdom territory, and and so. But I think clearly, whenever we say we don't want the church to be in charge of the state necessarily, we don't think that's necessarily appropriate. I don't think anybody who says that means that we want an amoral state, that we want a state that
Right.
has no moral foundation or
Mm-hmm.
moral sensibilities or anything like that. Clearly, that's not what we're talking about. Um, and I think one of the things that is clear, I would say, in the New Testament is that God does ordain government to restrain evil. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess I would say, just me speaking, I would want a government that's as moral as possible by Christian standards, but that is as limited as possible as well,
Mm-hmm.
and that gets as close to Christian ideals as possible. Exactly what that looks like in every case, I don't really have a clear answer to that. I think it's an
Mm-hmm.
ambiguity, like I said, that isn't clearly resolved. But I do think that this is a place where there have been centuries of work done that I'm not really the master of, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly Catholic theologians have worked on this much more completely than Protestant theologians have, because from early centuries the Catholic Church has been allied with state governments all over the world. And so they've given a lot of careful theological thought to this, and I think if this were something that somebody wanted to delve into, I would think it would be irresponsible to ignore the work that they've done over the centuries. And also
Hmm.
in the Reformed tradition, I think one of the things that I think makes a lot of sense in the Reformed tradition is the notion that God is sovereign over all of creation, including government. So government would be like a
Mm-hmm.
sector or a segment of the world over which God is Lord and sovereign. Well, I certainly don't disagree with that. I just wouldn't say. I just don't think that God is active in the same way in the government as he is, say, in the church or what have you. And so I think, again, the Reformed tradition would be a lovely treasure, I would say. The work that they've done on parsing this out, it would be worth doing. And one early writer in this, I think the Dutch in Holland, they did a lot of careful work on this back in the, what would it be, the 1700s. And I think it's Abraham Kuyper, who was the prime minister of Holland, was an ardent Calvinist and an ardent Christian, and has written and thought carefully and beautifully about what it means to serve God as the sovereign over all of creation. So he's thought about that, but then he's also
Mm-hmm.
applied it specifically to the government. He served as prime minister of his country, and
Wow.
wrestled through some of these issues. So
What's his name again? I'd love to look into him
Kuyper,
more.
Kuyper,
Okay.
and I think his
Wow.
first name is Abraham, Kuyper, Kuyper. So he's
Hmm.
a Dutch theologian and prime minister, and I think his dates. I'm just not sure.
So I'm guessing if he's someone you're referring to with respect, he didn't come in with a heavy Christian hand and do lots of legislating Christian faith in this
I don't.
country.
That's a good question. I really don't know his history, and that would be an interesting case study for me to spend some time on. It would help me to develop my understanding a little more fully of what this might look like. I've just heard him spoken of very respectfully by Reformed thinkers that I respect,
Okay.
and I know that he and his colleagues did real careful work on this. So I'm not very well informed beyond that.
Okay. All right.
Two other, I mean, back to your broader question about history, though, there's two other thinkers I wanted to mention, if for people who are new to this, and
Yeah.
they're the two Niebuhr brothers, Niebuhr, from the 1900s. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book in the, let's see, do I have the publication date? I don't think I have it here. In the mid 1900s, the early 1900s, he wrote a book that shaped a lot of people's thinking about this, called Christ and Culture. Christ and Culture. And he has 5 different relationships that he talks through in the book between the way Christ could be related to culture. Not government specifically, but he would include government in the culture of the secular culture that we're connected to. So, just as an example, like Christ over culture would be one of them. Christ above or over culture, Christ of culture, and the one that he clearly thinks is preferable is Christ transforming culture, where as Christians we would hope that Jesus is actively at work and that we are his hands and feet to see culture transformed in all of its aspects. And I would say that from an Anabaptist perspective, we would offer probably a sixth one, maybe, that we would call something like Christ forming a counterculture, that Christ's will and Christ's purposes are more fully seen in the church, and that we would see the church as a counter culture, even in the best of times, that the church would be still look somewhat different from the world because of that. Then his brother Reinhold also wrote, and he's best known for the perspective called Christian realism, which basically argues that Jesus' teaching, his more idealistic content, is for the age to come, but that we live in the present age, and we need to be realistic about that. And so Jesus' teaching is more aspirational for the age to come. It's what we aspire to, what we look forward to, where we'll be in the age to come. But that in the real world, we need to make hard choices, and you got to. This is kind of crude. He would never say it this way, but you got to do what you got to do. You need to make but it's called Christian realism. And that has shaped a lot of people's thinking as well about, especially something like involvement in the military, where clearly, you are sometimes called as a military person to do things that would be kind of hard to justify on New Testament ethics. But Niebuhr would have no problem with that. He would say, well, or like C.S. Lewis says, my country calls me to. He has an essay called "Why I'm Not a Pacifist," and he says in part, because my country needs me, and I'm serving the cause of my country, and
Mm-hmm.
God understands that, and that's a
Hmm.
kind of Christian realism.
Interesting.
Like there's no other
Man,
way to go forward here, so I need to do this.
yeah. It sounds like there are parts of both of those philosophies or just approaches that I really want to agree with.
Yeah.
And it
Oh
feels
yeah,
hard
they're all
to pick
smart,
between
thoughtful
them.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. And did you say they're actually brothers or they just share the same last name?
No, they're brothers.
Wow,
They
that's
were.
so interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder what the holidays were like around there. Just eyeballing
Probably
each
hard to
other
keep
across
up with the
table.
conversations. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. So maybe speak into that then a little bit more. What you mentioned Christ transforming culture as the most preferable, at least according to that author. But I would guess that is probably the one you would pick as well. Um, what do you think that looks like? What are some important aspects that distinguishes that from Christ over culture? Because when you said that, in my mind, I'm thinking Jesus is Lord, thinking, God is sovereign. So at first when you said that, I was thinking, oh, that one sounds pretty good. But when you said Christ transforming culture, I was like, I know that, that sounds more like Jesus to me.
Yeah.
So how do you distinguish those two? Because I think that's probably the most common one people would go to, most Christians would go to,
Yeah.
rather than transforming culture.
Well, I probably wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, if I were picking a perspective myself, I think I would choose the one I offered, which would be Christ forming a counterculture.
Oh, right.
But
Yeah,
if
you
I
said
have
that.
to
Okay.
pick from his five, then yeah, I probably would pick the transforming. I think when he talked about Christ above culture or over culture, I think what he was saying is that one of the ways to think about culture is that Jesus is actually at work within the present culture, bringing about the age to come by working through the present day culture.
Hmm.
And I don't think that would. I don't. Yeah, that's not a view I would hold.
Mm-hmm.
Christ transforming culture would be to say that we're focusing on God's work in converting people and like sending converted people into all aspects of culture
Mm-hmm.
with the again with the notion that culture will be transformed by their presence to look more and more like the kingdom of God. And it's at that point that I would sort of part ways with that perspective and say, well, we might hope and work for things to look more like the kingdom of God, but that's not ever really going to happen because it's not an area that's specifically under the rule of Christ. It's not welcoming the rule of Christ. But I'm not an expert with Niebuhr's framework. I just know of it, and I think if people
Yeah.
want to pursue that and look into it, it's easy to do. So even online, you can find detail on that. But certainly, the book Christ and Culture would be a place to go. Oh, yeah, here we go. We're gone again. Ah.
Oh, we back?
Yeah, I just heard you. We went away,
Oh,
and then now we're back.
okay.
I was just trying to decide if I was going to stop my recording or not.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Editing that will be not a problem. So
Yeah, I guess I was just saying that I'm not really an expert with Niebuhr's framework, but I think people who want to pursue that, you can find there's lots of resources on that.
yeah. Well, so let me challenge something for the sake of the
Sure.
discussion that you just said.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
you're saying, we should send converted people into all areas of society, and then Niebuhr would say we should see transformation come through those people. And maybe what you would say is that's a nice idea, but that's probably not going to happen. So what we actually need to do is just form a counterculture that acts to provoke the general culture, maybe. But so my challenge is, have we not gotten any closer to the kingdom of God over time. So what I'm thinking of is just in general governments who provide more freedom to their people and offer more moral set of rules. Oh, hey.
I Okay, we're back now. You started in with pushing back, and then I lost our connection.
Oh, okay. So you didn't hear me after that.
This says poor connection. Switch to audio only. But let's just try it. Let's keep going.
Okay.
So no, I didn't really hear the question in its entirety. So you said you wanted to push
Okay.
back on the Niebuhr stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just push back on that for
Sure.
a second and say that so Niebuhr might say we should send converted people into other areas of society to see transformation, and what you would say is we should send those people there, but we shouldn't really put our faith in that transformation coming about. We should just have those people there as an alternative, as a counterculture, as maybe there to provoke the culture overall and to call them into a higher way of living or something along those lines. I'm probably not,
Yeah.
saying it exactly
Yeah.
how you would, but something along those lines. And then, so my challenge is, have we not, through better government decisions or just even a step back from that, better forms of government, have we not gotten closer to real justice? Have we not made progress towards the what we hope to find ultimately in the kingdom of God, and a government that we believe is going to be perfect, that Jesus is going to come, and the form of government that comes is going to be Jesus' kingship.
Right.
But have we not made any progress towards society? And I'm just thinking of the Western world, where we have taken these Judeo-Christian foundations, and we have seen a lot more freedom. We have seen a lot more justice in the countries who have adopted those tenets, and they've started from that kind of belief system. So that makes me think that I would think more along the lines of Niebuhr and say, we not only could do that and could send people into society and hope for transformation, but we have done that. We have sent people, converted people into different places in society, and we really have made progress towards the things that will ultimately come about through the kingdom of God, but have seen partial progress in that direction.
Well, I guess I would say that I think that we would hope that having Jesus followers in all areas of society would move those areas of society in a kingdom direction. So yes, I would hope that that would be what would happen. I guess including the government where possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think though that the notion would. I think that the two things I would hesitate to support though is the notion that there's the steadier linear progress, that it's all it's all movement up and to the
Yeah.
right, that we're always seeing this progress. I
Mm-hmm.
think that yeah, there may be some things that worked out well. I think there are some other things that worked out really poorly. I think there's maybe some good things that were done, and then some great harm that was done along the way.
Mm.
And I also so that's one thing. The other is that I think I would never expect that any of those realms in secular society would ever achieve like full flourishing, full
Yeah.
value. And I don't think probably most Christians wouldn't necessarily think that that would be the case.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, that doesn't even really happen in the church. I mean, I would hope that that would happen more perfectly or
Yeah.
more fully in
Right.
the church. But yeah, the
That's a
truth
good
is
point.
that yeah, I mean, we have setbacks in the church too, and
Mm-hmm.
God's kingdom is not fully realized in the church in our time as much as we might hope it would be. I guess what I would say though is that I have a lot of confidence. I have more confidence that God is fully at work to accomplish His purposes in and through the church than I am to say that in any other arena. Maybe that's a
Yeah.
better way to say it. That God is.
Yeah.
I'm most confident that God is most directly and most clearly at work within His people, within the church, than I am about exactly what God is maybe doing in other areas of society.
Mm-hmm. And so what I hear a lot in what you're saying is that it's really our approach needs to be fitting with the age that we live in. So we believe that in a coming age, the kingdom of God will be fully realized, and there will be this redemption, this full redemption of creation
Yes.
after Jesus' second coming, and
Yes.
that's what we're all longing for and hoping for.
Mm-hmm.
And the age we live in, we want to do as well as we can, and we
Mm-hmm.
want to represent Jesus as much as we can,
Mm-hmm.
but we're always going to be
Yeah.
limited in by the age that we live in, restricted by the fact that Jesus has not come back yet.
Yeah. Well, and I think also I would just say that it helps. It's important for us to, as we undertake that, to be students of history and to realize that we're not the first people to try to advance the purposes of Christ in government, or to advance the purposes of
Yeah.
Christ in entertainment, or to do so in
Mm-hmm.
business, and to learn from the mistakes that people have made before us, and to be
Mm-hmm.
humble about the prospects. I guess to say, well, I realize this isn't going to be perfect, and I realize that I'm not going to accomplish everything I wanted to, but I am going to commit to be a godly, moral person as I go about this. And if I veer off that track, I want people to make that clear to me.
Yeah.
But I think that sometimes people get drawn in by the seduction of the power, or the money, or whatever, and it turns their
Mm-hmm.
heads, and then they end up repeating the mistakes that people made before them.
Yeah.
So,
I feel like another mistake that have really seen derail people, or I think this is why people get derailed sometimes, is that they have too much faith in themselves. I think people believe in their own goodness a little too often, and
yeah,
I think this is not he's not a theologian or anything, but it is a profound quote. And I'm not going to say it word for word, but Carl Jung said something like the line between good and evil does not fall between men or between nations. It cuts through the heart of every
right.
man.
That's right.
And
Yep.
I
Yep.
just think I've been talking with Matt about this a lot, and I just feel like there's this overestimation that is so common of all of our
Yeah.
ability to follow
Yeah.
through on our good intentions
Yeah.
and actually do the type of things that are going to make a positive difference.
Yeah.
And so that's yeah, I just think that could be something helpful as well, to just
Yeah.
have respect for your own capacity to do good and to do evil.
Absolutely.
And
I
it's not like, oh, if I just become the one in charge of making that decision, everything will definitely be better
Yeah.
because I'm a
Yeah.
Christian, or because I think that I just have better intentions than everybody else. And I think
Yep.
that is just so prideful.
I think that would go a long way in all of the arenas that we've talked about, to have people be chastened by their own limitations. I think that would that would be huge. But I think what happens is that we tend to individually, like I tend to assume that I'm a good-willed person. I'm a person of goodwill, and
Yeah.
so I tend to kind of overlook my flaws and my faults, and I think, oh
Hmm.
well, even if what I did hurt that person, it was probably necessary, or it was probably the only
Yeah.
way to do it, or it's forgivable,
Hmm.
or whatever. Yeah, we tend to give each other space on that. We tend to, minimize our oversights. I think the other thing that I see is that that plays into this, and I think this happens both. I would say in the business world, where I have some experience, and then in the church. I think a lot of
Hmm.
times what happens is that people are insecure about who they are, and about their value, their identity, and who they are. And so I think they look to accomplishments in politics, or accomplishments in the church, or accomplishments in business to say, oh, if I could only like have a church that does this, or if I could only achieve this level in business, then I would be
Hmm.
somebody, I would be meaningful, and so on. And so I think the temptation is great to take shortcuts, to do whatever's
Yeah.
necessary to get there,
Hmm.
and to just to lose track of my moral bearings and my peace in Christ and all of those things
Hmm.
in my quest for identity and significance and security. I want all those things, and so. Along the way, I'm a good-willed person, so I tend to forgive myself for the things that I do that actually don't line up with being being a moral person. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I think we are all prone to accept our own intentions, but
Yep.
only measure other people by the results.
Yep.
I think we we really want to believe that because our intentions in something are good, or we are overestimating how good those intentions were, and we don't recognize that, hey, maybe it was like 70% good and
Yeah.
maybe it's 30% not so great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then but we believe that the intention, we see the goodness in our intentions and maybe overestimate that. But with other people, it's, hey, the result of your good, or however, maybe good and bad together intentions
Yep.
affected me this way, and that was the result. And so that's how I'm going to measure you and hold you accountable for the results.
Yeah.
But I only want to be held accountable for my my intentions that I started
Right.
out with.
Well, there's
Yeah.
actually, in slightly different terms, social psychologists have actually studied this phenomenon. They call it the fundamental attribution error. And what they say is that when you make a mistake, I tend to attribute your mistakes to internal motivations. I mean, you make mistakes because of things inside of you. But when I
Yeah.
make mistakes, they are always the result of external factors. So I tend to think, well, when I did something wrong or I made a mistake, it was because of the circumstances, it was because of what was happening around me. But if you make
Yeah.
that same mistake, it's because of the kind of person you are, and it's due to internal factors. And they call that the
Man.
fundamental attribution error. The main mistake people make in attributing the cause of behavior is that exactly that.
Wow. I think that's so profound and would go a long way to understand and to keep in mind. It just makes me think too of how important it is for us to have grace for each other
Yeah.
in all directions, and to, yeah, like the Bible says, like love covers over a multitude of, what is that verse?
Sins.
What's that? Multitude of sins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Grace, grace, grace. All right.
Well, humility
did you
about
have something
myself
else?
and grace for you would be a great combination.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, man. Let's do that for sure. All right. So my next question, I wanted to ask. So right now in 2020, well, first of all, how do you see the political landscape right now? How do you see it? Does it feel crazier than it's ever felt? Does it feel more divided than it's ever been? Or, looking back over your decades of paying attention as opposed to my approximately like 4 or 5 years of paying attention, how do things feel as opposed to times gone by? And I guess let's just start with that.
You're talking about national politics in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yep.
Well, I definitely think things are more polarized. I feel like the people, I was going to say like two ends of the same pole, but there's probably multiple poles that you could be at. But I feel like people are further down in their holes than they used to be. And I think the notion of having a government, and I also think that it seems to me that the government has lost its focus on governance, and it's more focused on fundraising and partisanship and all of that. And I feel like what's good for the people has gotten seems to be more obscure. Now, maybe that was always less clearly a focus for the leaders than it seemed to be when I was younger. I don't know, but I think that that feels true to me now. I think that another thing that I think this maybe predates my lifetime, but certainly has gotten worse in my lifetime, is I feel like our national will to address difficult problems seems to be at a low point. And I think maybe that's related to the partisanship, that we argue about how to fix things, but we don't actually fix anything. And so I feel like I've seen a whole series of presidents, campaign against the national debt and campaign, about fiscal responsibility, but then nobody ever fixes the problem. They just make it worse, it seems. So I feel like we're further down in some of those holes than we were when I was younger. And the courage and the I don't know what all it's going to take to fix some of them. We're in some pretty deep holes financially and otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I don't really know, what the future looks like there. But So I think, yeah, because like I said earlier, I am not, really heavily engaged. I think when I look at what's happening, I feel like it doesn't make me very hopeful, I guess, as for about
Mm-hmm.
politics as it's currently practiced as a solution.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of a short answer, but
Yeah. No, that works. And
yeah.
so, how do you personally want to respond to that, to feeling that way? And how do you see other Christians responding? Either, thinking of people that you say, oh man, they're having a really good response to the political landscape right now, or generally not, names or anything, but just people that you see and you think you're like cringing, thinking like, oh, that's not such a great Christian response to to what's going on in politics right now.
Well, I guess in terms of where I put my energies, I'm a pastor. I'm a working pastor, so I would say I pour my energies into shaping people's Christian imaginations and to calling people to, well, to follow Christ more fully, to love each other more deeply, and then to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit in their lives. I don't really have specific counsel for people to how to engage politically. I'm more interested in how they treat each other and how
Hmm.
we navigate different political viewpoints within the church. And so, yeah, I mean, to the extent that Christian. I mean, I guess I would advocate for candidates who care about people on the margins, for people who value life and preserving and valuing life. I think that's important. Caring for the poor, those kind of things. So I guess I would, I talk about those things, but I don't talk about specific candidates or specific programs or policies, what have you.
Yeah.
Um, so that's where I put my energy. I think when you ask me like who do I respect in terms of how they're navigating this, one of the people that I have really thought highly of is Russell Moore. Russell Moore is, at least he has been. I'm not sure what he's doing at the moment, but he has been a lobbyist, I think, for the Southern Baptist Convention, and he lives, I think, in Washington.
Okay.
And he writes and speaks. He's very articulate and writes well, but he's very thoughtful, I think, and very measured in his perspective. And I find him to be careful in that way. So he's somebody that comes to mind as a Christian who's, really fully engaging the issues of the day.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess, let's see, a columnist that I've read from time to time, I think his name is David Brooks from the New York Times. I think he's Jewish. But yeah, he's very thoughtful, and I think measured, careful. I think he's recognized as a conservative columnist.
Okay.
I think I'm conservative on some things and liberal on others. So I'm not really registered as a party person myself. I usually tell
Yeah.
people I agree with about 60 to 70% of what each party stands for. And so I don't really know how to vote. It puts me in a difficult situation. But anyway,
Yeah.
wandering off topic. I mean, I guess I would just say I tend to be more excited about politicians who I think really do care about the common good and are willing to lead from the courage of their convictions rather than the kind of leadership that we talked about earlier that's
Hmm.
just cynically pursuing power and money and wants to just stay in office.
Yeah.
Um, it seems to me that there are fewer of those kind of people at the national level, but those are the kinds of politicians that I find more appealing.
Hmm.
Um, so, but
Yeah.
like I said, it's not something that's a big focus for me. So I don't have a long list of people that I follow on social media or what have you that are who are really fully engaged in politics.
Hmm.
Um, so
Yeah. Sure. So I want to ask you more too about you. You said it feels true that we're in a more divided time than you can remember, or people have dug down deeper into their holes
yeah,
than they
yeah,
have that you remember.
yeah,
Um, that So I mean, both from a Christian perspective, that doesn't sound like a good thing, but
right.
also just from any perspective I could think of, and that I mean, even if you are not a Christian, no matter what you believe, and you're just thinking of the situation of government from a secular worldview, it just doesn't sound like a good thing any way you look at it. It seems like moving forward, what
Right.
we really need is unity and to come together around something, a set of ideals, the things that
Hmm.
we can agree on, finding common ground. And that's kind of as a, I don't know, from what I can remember when I was younger, that's kind of the idea that I had of government, that it was people, I just kind of had this picture of people who were out there making these decisions that, agreed about some things and disagreed about other things, but we're trying to do the best for
Right. Right.
for everybody, for the whole
Right.
population. But yeah, it just doesn't feel like that's an accurate picture to what is really going on. So anyway, my question is, what do you think has contributed to people being dug so deep into their holes, and how do we ourselves come out of those holes in any way that we've sunk down into them, and also call other people out into the open to have free dialogue and find unity
Yeah.
for going forward?
Yeah. Well, I think that, two things that occur to me that I think have made the problem worse. One is that I feel like politicians have, um, I think there are specific politicians who made national politics more combative and more polarized. I think some of them worked at that deliberately, and
Hmm.
tended to undermine the bipartisan consensus model and viewed it
Mm-hmm.
as, not very effective, or not, just not not combative enough, not, engaged with the real problems enough, whatever. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
there's been some specific and intentional efforts to work in that. Then the other thing I think has happened is the emergence of social media. I think that social media has tends to give more attention to the loudest voices, and especially
Mm-hmm.
voices at the margins. And in some ways, that's positive. I think a medium that gives voice to people who get overlooked or who don't get to participate in the conversation, I think that's a good thing. But I think what has happened in practice is that, it's those media just turn out to be more polarizing, partly because of how the algorithms work. I think the algorithms tend to sort your
Mm-hmm.
feed and my feed for the more extreme voices, because what they want is they want us glued to the screen, and so they're moving us more and more in the direction of tabloid like stuff.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
clickbait, we want you to stay on there, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think everything is just a little further out than you are. It kind of gets your attention, and they know that, and
Hmm.
so they're providing that to you. And I also think that the other problem there is that some of those views are just not all that well informed. It's great that anybody with a microphone and a video camera can broadcast to millions. On the one hand, that's great, because it means that even a relatively unknown person can impact the whole world. But the
Mm-hmm.
problem is that a number of those overlooked people haven't studied what they're talking about very much, and they're
Yeah.
just sort of talking off the top of their head. They don't really know what they're talking. They don't know much history or whatever,
Right.
and they're really talking about that. But the other thing is, I think social media tends to emphasize emotion over careful thought, and give much more attention to like soundbite and clever quips rather
Mm-hmm.
than thoughtful, nuanced discussion of something. And so
Yeah.
all of that, I think, all of those things in a stew together, I think, make for more polarization, and it makes it harder for people to appreciate other people across differences. And so, one of the things that one of the things that I try to do in is to use my platform, is to, especially in the church, to say to Christians, even if nobody else in the world could get along with each other, we should be able to do this, and we
Mm-hmm.
should be all stars at loving people, respecting people that we disagree with.
Yeah.
That should be something that we are known for. People should,
Mm-hmm.
even if nobody else was good at this at all, they should be able to look at us in the church and say, wow, look what they're doing. Look how they get along. There are
Yeah.
Republicans there. There are Democrats there. There are poor people. There are rich people. There are black people.
Mm-hmm.
There are white people. There are, whatever the difference is, highly educated people, not well educated people, whatever it is. And
Yeah.
they love each other like brothers and sisters in families do. And isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like in the church I have a platform and a basis upon which to call people to that. And beyond that, I guess I invite people to consider that, just because it's a good idea. Uh,
Yeah.
And so, like in my neighborhood, I want to be a good neighbor to my neighbors and to be a
Mm.
good influence. And if I wander into conversations where it's gossip about that neighbor, I try to say, well, it's that person has redeeming values too, redeeming
Hmm.
qualities, and to try to help bridge those gaps.
Yeah.
So, those are some thoughts that occur to me.
Yeah. So we've talked. This is another thing we've talked about offline as well. But yeah, I realized with what you're saying about social media how much that is reality. It is. I don't think I can think of a single issue that from how I've seen it represented on social media that it's actually helped me to have a more nuanced perspective, at least for maybe with the exclusion of YouTube videos or podcasting isn't really social media, but things that are more informative and longer format, which can provide more of the full discussion around an
Right.
issue. That's really helpful. What's really not helpful is seeing people's just emotional reaction to a video or seeing somebody's very uneducated opinion about what this person said or what that person said or this
Right.
incident that happened, and then the comments that go back and forth, thinking specifically of Facebook. It's just not a good way to have those discussions. And I
Yeah.
think the biggest reason is that you're not face to face with somebody. That's the number one thing in my mind, is that you're so limited in your communication skills because you're not face to face. And even this is, we're not in person, but I can still see your face. I can hear
Right.
the tone of your
Right.
voice. And as we're
Right.
talking about
Right.
those things,
Right.
I'm not constantly having these thoughts of, oh, what did he really mean by
Yeah.
saying that? So
Yeah.
much is communicated through your tone and through what your face even looks like,
Mm-hmm.
seeing a smile on their face or just seeing that they're not yelling or,
Right.
so many things that you could interpret in a certain way over Facebook. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge limitation. And I think another one is just the amount that you can communicate. It takes so much time and effort to write out some really long Facebook post or some really long response to somebody's Facebook post, but it doesn't feel as difficult to just have the discussion and have a longer, more nuanced talk about something like we're doing right now if
Right.
you're face to face, if you
Right.
if you choose a different platform. And so that's even part of the it's not one of the initial reasons we thought of doing this podcast, but as things have developed over the time since we first thought of it, I've realized that's one of the really important reasons for us to be doing this, because I am still just a young man trying to figure out so many things and what I see in society and how I'm interpreting the world and what's going on. And so I need this so desperately. I need to have conversations that are longer format, and it's
Mm-hmm.
so nice now that we do have the internet, and this is more possible to talk to somebody anywhere in the world. That
Yeah.
it's easier to do that than ever before. And so instead of just hearing from your angry Uncle Bill or your
Right. Right.
bitter neighbor about some
Right.
issue, it's like
Right.
you can pick and choose and still hang around with those people and be a lover of everybody, but you also have the opportunity to reach out to people who are well informed and do have more expertise, and to have conversations that are actually going to be beneficial in developing a nuanced opinion about something, rather than just pushing you towards the edges
Mm-hmm.
of an idea
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
encouraging you to engage in this culture of outrage, as it's
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
labeled.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep. Yep.
how has that been for you too? So we talked politically, but specific to social media, how have you seen that change things? Even outside of politics, just in the way that people relate to each other.
Well, I think you answered that question just now in terms of the exposure that you talked about in terms of like how people relate to each other. I was thinking as you were talking that your angry Uncle Bill has always been out there, but you haven't had to confront him as often or as regularly or in such a
Yeah,
rapid
right.
turnaround way
Yeah.
as you do now. When Uncle,
Hmm.
that person can be posting video on Facebook and on YouTube and can just be blasting things out there all the time.
Yeah.
The turnaround time on that stuff can be, much more quick, and it's much more immediate, and the volume of it is much greater.
Yeah.
I would say I would say that social media works great as a supplement to personal relationships. So that if I know you and I see you in person, and then oh by the way we also talk, we also communicate sometimes on Facebook, or we also occasionally will send each other a YouTube clip or something like that. That's fine. That's great. Or an email. That's great. But then
Mm-hmm.
there's a personal relationship that provides a foundation for that interaction, and I think it also then tends to limit somewhat how rude I'm going to be to you or the vocabulary I'm going to use with you, because I have a real world relationship with you that I want to maintain and I want to foster. But if you're
Yeah.
just a random name or face out there, and I'm willing to let myself go on this stuff, with
Mm-hmm.
profanity and all that stuff, then it seems like
Yeah.
it creates more of an opportunity for that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I'm old enough to remember days before there were any forms of social media, and so one of the things that I just kind of I'm still sort of scratching my head about is this phenomenon that people um, that seems to be fairly standard, that there are people on the internet who are on the internet primarily to unload bile and hate and
Yeah.
profanity, and I think what is that? I mean, who
Yeah.
wants to live that way, and who can live with that? What kind of person is that?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that every time you do something like that, you move yourself deeper into that hole. And
Yeah.
anyway, so that's a little bit off track, but
Yeah,
uh,
no, but that's an interesting psychology discussion. Of, why do people feel that freedom to behave that way? I
yeah,
mean, I guess one simple answer is that there's just less there are fewer and different social repercussions for
yep,
behaving that way on
yep,
Facebook
yep,
with total strangers than if you're just in your own neighborhood or at some nearby park or something where people actually know who you are.
yep.
It's a different thing, but yeah, beyond that, why do people feel that? And anyway, that's getting a little bit off things, but yeah, anything else you want to say about how social media is changing things?
Well, I mean, I think it's great that it was here when we had this COVID curtain come down, because it allowed us to stay in touch with each other in ways that we
Yeah.
wouldn't have we wouldn't have been able to do before. So it's
Mm-hmm.
changed us in that sense. Not that we have experience with this kind of thing, but it was a tool that was handy to have when that happened. Um, I think we've seen the emergence of the big companies. You read about in the news the big tech companies, but there were big companies before. I don't know if there were ones quite this big, but um, so I don't really know. But in terms of how it impacts like personal communications, I think it's made a wider range of communications possible, um, and allow people to connect with each other and find each other that wouldn't have been able to do that before. But as we've said, it also brings some attendant costs with it as well. Um, and I finished graduate school in sociology before anybody had really started studying the impact of online connections, because I was just coming into maturity as I was finishing graduate school. But
Yeah.
I'm sure that people are making careers out of studying online behavior now, and I
Mm-hmm.
hope they are, because I think it's something that needs to be studied. We want to understand how
Oh yeah.
what's happening there. So
Yeah. Yeah. A book that I read right before we moved back to Kona from Berlin over the summer was called 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You.
yeah,
And that book just
yep,
pierced me.
yep,
It
yep,
just got me, and I realized it's so true. I mean, our technology is, not just social media, but also the availability through a smartphone that's just always right on your hip. It's always can always get your attention,
yep.
in a way just has this power over you that's so important to be aware of. And I think I'm a little bit encouraged to see that I feel like Christians have woken up to that going on and that reality pretty quickly, at least relative to the broader culture. So I'm encouraged by that. But I think it's something we need to. Maybe that's one of the areas where we can, go out from the church walls and see transformation in society too. And as you're saying, a lot of people, I'm sure, are studying this, and I wonder, in the years to come, if the newest health habits and things will be having a lot to do with how you manage your smartphone usage, and I wonder if you'll see that on magazines and things like 10 tips to
Yeah.
not have your life wrecked by technology or something.
Well, I will say one of the things I've been kind of grateful for is I think having been an adult before social media became a thing, is that I'm comfortable with and familiar with life without it, and so I don't feel like it's a central. Like I don't feel desperate if it's not a focus of my day or my life. I just got a new smartphone a week or two ago, and one of the things I've been doing over the last few weeks is, since I got it, is whenever notifications come up, I look at it and I say, wait a minute, I don't want that program to be notifying me of anything. And so I go and I find where that program is in its notification settings, and I turn the notifications off for another app. And so that's one of the things I've been doing the last 2 weeks, is turning off notifications. But not everybody wants to do that, and I think a younger person probably wants, like they feel like they're missing something if they're not up to date with all those apps. But when I do that, I think, oh, Karl, you're just an old codger here. You just want to use this phone the way you want to use it, and are resisting what it's trying to make.
No, I don't think you should think that way at all. I think that my people in my generation and my age group need to hear things like that. I think the things we need to hear is of people your age saying, hey, it's fully not just possible, but maybe like the same or preferable to do your life without that thing, or at least without all the constant notifications. Like, you don't need every single one of your apps to send you notifications, or you don't need to have it on you all the time. Like, maybe just spend an hour or two a day with the thing fully turned off. Like, I think, things like that are so huge. And I think I'm kind of right in between of people who, people maybe even like 10 years older than me probably would be more still in that same boat. Obviously not in the same time frame, but more in the just before smartphones took over. I feel like I'm right on the borderline of that, and I feel like I look at people older than me and I'm like, they have an even better idea of what it's like to do life without smartphones. And I look at people younger than me and I see, oh, they have no clue what it's like to do life without smartphones, without social media. And that's it's something that we need to address, but it's almost just hard to admit. Like, it's so sad to me that I don't even want to go there in my mind of thinking how we respond to that reality. I just feel right now, if I'm honest, kind of in denial of that, and just thinking like, no, that it can't be that we've gotten to the point where kids are so addicted to their phones that they literally can't imagine life without them. It just, we can't have gotten to that place, but I think we have, and it's important to find where we go from here.
Well, so I mean, that's one thing, is how I interact with it, but then there's another area which we started talking about, which is how it's impacting me and how it's impacting my, the way I treat other people, the way I think about other people, especially with regard to political engagement and so on. And I've preached a sermon on what your cell phone is doing to you, but I also have preached about the importance of loving people who are different from you. Just keep coming back to that and giving examples of where it's happening, and just keep calling people to that over and over and over. So that's a lot of where I've put my energies over the last little while.
Yeah, that's great. Simple but profound advice. All right. Well, I think we should wrap up, but thanks so much for taking the time today. This was a privilege getting to talk this way. Obviously, we get to talk in a lot of other settings informally, but it's fun to have you on this podcast and have you be a part of it right here towards the beginning of it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's good to see your face. Since we live in different states, it's nice to have a chance to connect. And I think this format allows us, we're both a little better behaved this way than if we're sitting in person and the conversation just kind of rambles and goes around and around. This way we have to take turns and keep our focus on this conversation. So
yeah, definitely more focused, if nothing else, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, well, thank you. And all the best as you continue with this project.
So. All right. Thanks. Bye, everybody.